Okay, welcome everyone. I see people are starting to join the office hour. Thank you for joining us today. This is the TapClicks and GA4 customer office hour. And please grab some water, coffee, tea, whatever you'd like to drink, and bring your questions. Those of you that registered and already asked questions, thank you so much for submitting those. We're going to talk about GA4 and TapClicks today. And my name is Angela Hicks. I am the Director of Education and Training here at TapClicks. And more importantly, I'm joined by Brian Butler today, our CEO and co-founder of SmartTech, which is a fabulous TapClicks partner. So Brian, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Hello, everyone. Nice to see everyone join our event today. We appreciate you coming.
And Brian, I'm hoping that you can tell us a little bit about your experience just in marketing in general, and especially with Google Analytics and TapClicks as well.
Absolutely. So yeah, my name is Brian Butler. I've been in digital marketing specifically for 15 years. I think it's actually going to be 16 years in October. It's pretty crazy to think about how long it's been. But yeah, so it's one of those situations where I've been around this industry for a while, and I've dealt with typically the sides of the industry that people tend to avoid. My experience is a blend of marketer and kind of like an impromptu developer, because I've had to choose to figure out how to solve problems that nobody else really wanted to try to solve. And so what that ended up making was a skill set that was very data heavy and a very, like a pseudo developer, in the sense that I'm not going to go out and build your website, but when it comes to Google Tag Manager and understanding what needs to be done, I can kind of translate marketer and developer into one kind of sense, right? And what we ended up doing was really bringing in TapClicks, 6-7 years ago as a primary tool, and that was something where we found great abilities to do, GA reporting, GA4 reporting, Google reporting, everything you could possibly want. And that developed into a relationship where it's really exciting, because SmartTech is now actually the exclusive small business certified partner for TapClicks. So if someone is in the very small business kind of space, our team is actually sanctioned to be able to support them and bring them to the table, provide support, provide training. It really becomes quite handy and helpful. But also with the TapClicks certification training we've done, we also are certified and trained with Google Analytics, GA4, and so on, Google Tag Manager. So we really bring a lot of that hyper complex problem solving to the table, where a lot of our clients are trying to figure out HubSpot integration, data feed management, GA4 implementation, migration, all those kind of things. And so what we bring to the table is essentially that kind of middle ground of knowledge, where it's really kind of nuanced, and there's not a lot of people working in that developer middle ground, where you're kind of having to feel like, I'm a marketer, but I got to get all this stuff figured out. What's a data layer? You know what I mean? Like, what's a e-commerce variable? Like, if you're not, your typical developer, you're working in marketing, and that's not typical language that you're going to be using on a day-to-day basis. It's not clicks, it's not impressions, it's not impression share. It's really a little bit more of a different monster. So we've come to the table helping to solve that problem and really kind of be an enabler of technology and marketing technology for people to be able to maximize and leverage and use those tools to the best of their abilities.
Brian, thank you so much for explaining your background, and I'm really excited to talk about GA4 and TapClicks today. It's great that you have all this expertise in using these two tools together. So here's what we're going to talk about, and for anyone that has joined a previous office hour, I hope you're thinking about joining another office hour. We change up our themes based on your questions, but we have a few things that we're going to talk about. So we're going to start with Universal Analytics versus GA4, really the differences that you need to be aware of and keep in mind. And tips for after GA4 migration. So as you may know, Google set forth this date of July 1, 2023, where everyone migrated over to GA4. So we'll give you some tips. And then we're going to talk a good bit about data in GA4, specifically around conversions and revenue. And then we'll talk about TapClicks templates. So we do have a GA4 template that you can use, and we'll give you some tips on that. And lastly, we'll wrap up with blending data. So that's thematically what we're going to be discussing today with Brian. And I just want to encourage everyone as we go along. This is an office hour. This is not a prepared webinar where we're going to talk at you for the full hour. As you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A feature or the chat. You can drop those questions in, and we will do our best to answer those in real time. So let's get into our first topic, Brian. Google Analytics versus GA4. So now that we've all migrated over to GA4, what do we need to know? What's different about these two?
Kind of the elephant in the room, right? Like everyone's trying to figure out, when do we migrate, when we transfer? There's still people who are seeing their data in GA and they're like, wow, I don't understand. Was this just a false flag? What's happening here? Like, why is this not changed over? It's definitely coming. I mean, just be mindful of it. You're going to start getting notifications from Google here very soon that data stopped reporting in your GA, and it's going to look, like an alert, but it's really them basically shutting off the pipeline, the data, right? And so, getting your GA4 set up now is super important. Getting it going is going to be super important. So just something to be mindful of. I actually do have a blog post that I created a little while back that was essentially, what the differences are between the two, and really what it is that any marketer should know. I'm going to put it down, a link to it in the chat here. And actually, Angie, do you want me to show the screen? I can give you an example of some of these details.
Oh, sure. That would be great.
Yeah. So let me pull it up real quick. So let's see here. Can you see my screen okay, Angie?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, so I'm not going to go over this verbatim, but I think it's important. And this covers a lot of the core basics that make the changes. I think the biggest one is event tracking. That's changing. Typically, how Google works is session-based. That's your standard view model, right? And how Google Analytics typically tracks is based on a session. The session comes in, and that session, typically has a user path. And that session essentially gets tracked to a conversion that generally has a last non-direct click attribution model. What that means essentially is if I go through a Google ad and I go into Google and I do on the website and Google tracks me, typically what's going to happen is if I click on that Google ad, it's going to track that view as a Google ad, session. But if I don't come back for another 7 days, and then I do come back and I go to the website directly and I go and make a purchase, Google has a very short window where it's going to look at that last session. And if it's not direct, say it's email, for example, it's going to give credit to the last source, the last session before that direct happened or before that sale happened. And it's really interesting because that last direct, non-direct click is very different in how it looks at the session data and how it unifies that data. Now, pardon me, a lot of people don't realize, but GA had a custom field you could leverage called the user ID. And when the user ID was able to be brought in as a custom dimension, and it would help to unify the session data so that if I came in on one device, came in on a second device, came in on a mobile phone, came in on a tablet, that device would essentially get unified based on that session ID or that user ID. So that brings us to event-based tracking. Event-based tracking changes the model up a little bit because instead of that user being tracked as a session, what it's tracked now is as an event. And that event is someone who comes in, takes action on the site. So the page loaded was an event. Someone watched a video is an event. Someone went through your funnel and went to a thank you page. That is an event that you now turn on as a conversion. So those events shift away from sessions and page view metrics being the predominant source of truth and into a new model where Google can take those different events and create a user journey out of that model. And it actually uses what's called data-driven attribution now to recognize all the different places that users come in from. And if there's an event that's happening that matches a session or matches a data view, it's going to try to bring those data points together so it can unify that session and understand that this event is being done by the same user. And it's usually based on Google's first-party data knowledge. So if you logged into Google, for example, it knows that you've logged into Google, and it's going to unify that information based on what you're doing, whether it's app-based, whether it's whether it's, site-based, mobile-based, for example. And so that whole session element makes a big difference. The other thing that changes with the event-based tracking is how Google treats app level data versus mobile data versus desktop data. Typically, app data is like the plumbing in your house, and the desktop and mobile is like your electrical. They don't typically cross. They usually are very much separate, right? They're separate but equal. And you never would want your electricity and your plumbing to come together, right? You don't want that data to supply. So how Google Analytics essentially treated that, instead of having a different profile, they use a data view that's called, a data stream that allows you to bring in that different data stream and access that data from the app differently than you access mobile and desktop. In the old days in GA, you'd have basically your GA set for desktop and mobile, and then you have your GA that was set for app. But they tried to create a unified metric in between those, and that unified metric or unified profile tried to bring those data points in. Well, with GA4, they've accelerated that and made it to where that data stream, which is an app-based data stream, has the ability to kind of understand what's going on more. You can see the data a bit better. So that's a pretty big difference between session-based tracking, event-based tracking, and then how event-based tracking applies to apps as well. There's a lot of content out there about the app systems. And if you're using a lot of the app tracking, I don't know the exact name of the app analytics software, I forget off the top of my head. But there's a lot of data out there if you want to look into it. The other big thing I would say here is a lot of the integrations with BigQuery, being able to export your GA3 data in and then visualize that data. We'll talk about how that's kind of outdated because of TapClicks. Not outdated, but not as relevant for TapClicks clients, I would say. The other big changes here are going to be a user-centric approach. So again, looking at cross-platform tracking across multiple apps, devices, also understanding how the events and the analysis tracks, making sure that you're looking at enhanced different measurements. Enhanced measurements are also really interesting because Google Analytics 4 has the ability to take a look at different events and actually create those events like page scroll or video view for you, so you don't have to create that goal as you would otherwise. That's another really cool update that they made to the system. Privacy centric, it is not centered around cookies anymore. It is a cookieless environment that is being phased out. So you have a cohort of data that they're bringing in versus a cookie data. And again, all this is really kind of heavy in the first party data sector. I think the other thing is, bounce rate has went away. And then one other metric that went away is calculated fields. So you can no longer create your own calculated metric inside of GA4, which you could do in GA. And we can talk a little bit later about how TapClicks kind of solves that problem for you a little bit, depending on how the custom dimensions you're working with kind of leverage.
Great, Brian.
I can let you share the screen again, but this is a really great article if you have any specific questions or want to deep dive into it.
Fantastic. So I hope that's helpful, just kind of giving everyone a primer on what's changed between Universal Analytics and GA4, what you need to keep in mind between these two. So Brian, as you mentioned, not everyone has exactly moved over to GA4, right? Installed your tracking code, but Universal Analytics has stopped collecting data. So I would like to, for some.
Yep.
So if you're on a paid account or 360, you might still be getting data there. But let's talk about those that are using GA4. I'd love it if you could give us kind of some tips. So once I set up GA4, get my tracking in place, what should I be mindful of?
So I'd say the first thing is to make sure that you review the migration checklist. Google provides it within the process. And the big thing that a lot of people I've noticed have been overlooking is the audience migration, being able to actually migrate your current audiences through a tool called the Audience Migration Tool. It's basically an extension or an add-on to Google Sheets. Use that sheet to download your audiences and then re-import those audiences back into GA4. That's a really big, helpful tool they created that a lot of people just aren't even using. The other thing that I'm seeing is a lot of people are forgetting that you can take your referral exclusions from GA3 and transfer them into GA4. That's a really big one because a lot of the referral exclusions were there for a reason, and kind of recognizing the value of those. I would say the other thing to think about is understanding how your data looks in GA3 currently. If it's still reporting, which some cases it is, they haven't turned off the flow of data for every single profile. So you may start getting the profile updates that you're starting to get that. But I would look at your current data, because if you're understanding, and this is where the biggest change I've seen is that revenue tracking and attribution tracking and how those data points configure are very different from GA to GA4. And the data layers that you have to put in play to make sure that your e-commerce tracking is tracking through, it is very different. So the biggest mistake we've seen people make so far is failing to make sure that everything is tracking on a pseudo one-to-one. And what I mean by that is, like, if you have a revenue for yesterday, for example, that was $300,000, and GA is showing you 295, but GA4 is showing you 150, there's likely a problem with your e-commerce setup, and the data layer variables are not firing through correctly. The other thing has to do with other third-party networks. Like, for example, we have clients who we've worked with in the past that have, like, for example, account-based marketing running, and those account-based marketing tools allow you to bring in third-party data like company name, or how many employees that company has, how much revenue that company has. And you can then create segments inside of GA3 that allowed you to build reports based on that ABM data. Well, those connectors have to be reset up for GA4. So if you have ABM running, or if you have account-based marketing where you are bringing in list data from that provider, that data is going to need to be reconnected to your GA4. Those are small things, but I mean, as you think about just data consistency, having that efficiency is going to, or having that consistency, I should say, and continuity is going to be super important. I would also make sure that you recognize that GA4 has a data lag. So you're not going to be doing a conversion test, right, and immediately seeing that data available to you. That data lag is real. It does take a little bit of time before that starts to process in there. We've seen a lot of clients have to wait 24 hours before the data actually really kind of settles. And then even after that, you might notice that there's a 10 to 12 to 15% discrepancy between your lead volume or your e-commerce volume yesterday and what you're seeing being reported in GA4 for yesterday. So it's really one of those situations where people need to recognize that there is no one-to-one anymore. It isn't like a situation where you're going to go into GA4 or GA3 and you're going to see two sessions, and two sales, right? Like, or two sales that led to two sales. You're not going to see that anymore. So recognizing that the cookieless environment and the iOS changes that happened, iOS 15, have made it to where iPhone users are able to basically disappear if they just don't click on your accept my cookie, parameter. And HubSpot is one of those companies where their, little prompt at the bottom of the page is pretty small. And if they fail to accept the cookies, it automatically declines access. So even if you have, not an iPhone, but you're looking through a site that's built on HubSpot and they don't click on that accept cookies, by default, Google Tag Manager cannot fire and collect that data because they haven't accepted cookies.
Right.
So you may
Brian,
very well find that your data is just, not matching one-to-one, and there's reasons behind that.
as I think about what marketers need to do for tracking, would you say that this update, this GA4 rollout, is helpful for marketers as we move away from cookies? In a nutshell, right, it's getting harder for marketers to track things. I guess just overall, would you say that GA4 is helping marketers with tracking and attribution?
My honest answer is no.
Okay.
Yeah.
And why is that?
Well, the honest answer is that we are all going to be dealing with a loss of data when it comes to tracking. Marketers have been spoiled for 10, 15 years, 20 years of no regulations in terms of how privacy and how data was handled. And I think it's time for us all to kind of wake up and recognize that that world we lived in is no longer a thing. It may sound harsh, but it's a truth. It's a true matter that we all have to be able to recognize. And there is a element where, yes, Google now has enhanced conversions. Facebook has the conversion API, and the conversion API, the enhanced conversions, both of those are meant to be able to connect to your server, which is essentially your Shopify site or your HubSpot, and then use that server level data to more accurately associate a conversion with a click or with an engagement. But the reason they're doing that is because it's all based on first party collected data. I'm a HubSpot certified expert as well. I can tell you right now, HubSpot is one of those companies where, as good as the data is, they can only collect so much data if someone fails to accept the cookies. So if you're not clicking yes, accept all cookies, there is definitely a situation where you're not going to have a one-to-one. And that one-to-one is something where, I mean, typically speaking, we've never had a full one-to-one, but even closer to a 90% one-to-one has been an ideal environment. That's not going to be the case going forward. And I think that we all need to recognize that there is a gray area, a gray matter of discrepancies that those users are active about having their privacy kept. They're active about having their data removed. Just Friday, I was dealing with a HubSpot client where their client had a status updated on the account that said removed due to GDPR compliance. Now, the HubSpot compliance prompt inside, so every email in their HubSpot log that they had sent this client, the data replaced it, said removed due to GDPR compliance.
Great. So important for those of you that are in Europe. Yep. With GDPR. Important. Yep.
Well, not only that, but California has their own data privacy regulations. And the thing is, a lot of people are saying we're in the US, it doesn't matter. Kind of does, because California and anybody who's using a California IP is subject to similar privacy laws that you get in the UK. And that is being passed amongst many different states. And we, probably the next 3 to 5 years, you're going to see more regulation around privacy, because as GDPR becomes more important, it's going to be more important in the US. So to answer your question directly, I do think that Google Analytics 4 changes up the picture to be more compliant, but it's not something that's going to help marketers find better attribution, right? It's going to do what it can, and it's going to try to tell a better data story, but it's still going to be limited to the people who are willing to accept cookies and let personalized advertising show and have their data be tracked, because those people who have opted out, there's no way to see that data. So anybody who tells you that they can see everything and that attribution's solved and Google Analytics is going to, it's just not the case. It's just not how the new world of marketing is going to be around. And there's some ways around it to a point, but we always need to be very mindful of the fact that we can see what we can see, and you can take precautions, and you can try to do different things to kind of get around some of these details. But the fact of the matter is they are changing.
Brian, thank you for sharing your thoughts and insights on everything that's happening with privacy and marketing and tracking. I would like to think about what metrics do matter. What can we see in TapClicks? And for everyone else, I'd like to encourage you to use the Q&A if you have any questions. But what metrics should we be focusing on? There are so many in GA4.
There really are.
And yeah, so if I think about bringing that into TapClicks, is it any and everything? Are there some metrics I should be more concerned with?
It's a good question. Let me see if I have a demo instance. Let's see here. If not, I'll use my own version here. I'm trying to show a visual, because the visuals personally, for me at least, help a little better. Yeah, I'm just going to grab a smart one. So I will pull up a GA instance, and I'll kind of showcase what I typically hear from clients when it comes to building these. Because in the end, that's what I think matters the most, is kind of what the clients are expecting to see when they log in. And that becomes a little bit more important, especially once you're going through and building your own reports and trying to kind of finalize that. So let me show this real quick. I'll share my screen again. Here we go. This is a good one. Go desktop one. I'll bring this over for everyone to see. Okay, so this is just getting into my instance of GA, so you can see an example. So what we've had as real-time experience back from companies who have seen the new GA4 templates inside of TapClicks, the feedback we've gotten from them is that they're getting a little bit confused when they go into the template and they try to look at GA and understand some of the data. And there's a pretty simple reason to that. Typically, the engineers are doing their best, and the team is doing their best to build those reports and those templates. There's just some customization that you're going to need to do to it to more adaptly fit your client need. And I think that's just kind of a basic understanding, right? So in my situation, just to show how we've built our version of that report, is we looked at what clients can see by default when they log into Google Analytics GA4. And I use the user acquisition because it's one of the only real predefined reports that you can get outside of the ones where you build it from scratch. And so new users is a field you can see inside of TapClicks. Engage sessions is as well. Engagement rate, session per user, events, conversions, revenue. All this is details that you can see inside of GA4. And it's all details that you can line out. What becomes a little more challenging is trying to make what's available to you in GA4 match what you have as far as users, new users. And that can become a little bit of a confusing situation sometimes, because if a client is trying to understand their data, they may not realize what they're seeing. So let me pull up the GA4 template real quick, and I'll show you an example of just some of the modifications that I personally have made with the versions that we're doing, just so we can understand some of the opportunities. So I'm going to pull this up real quick.
Thanks, Brian.
So we'll pull this up. So as we get into here, as you can add the GA4 template. If you haven't added the template yet, go to your section, and then under sections, you can add the GA4 template. If you had added it prior to probably July, you'll want to go in and remove it and then re-add it. And the reason why is because there was a little bit of a bug that was happening with the GA4 instance. I don't know the specifics of it. But I know for me personally, there was a couple of data views that were not enabled. And so this template had a lot of good data views that it was using, but they weren't available to everybody, at least not for me. So I had to undo it, delete it, and then re-import the new one when the engineering team finished that. So you import it in, use that as a new template, and then from here, you have the ability to modify it. The nice thing is the new template is using a mix of live call widgets and stored data widgets. The big thing is that your data available to you through GA4 in TapClicks is not as robust in the store data as it is in the live call widget. And for those of you who haven't used live call widgets yet, the summary of that data is essentially when you build a widget, you have the ability to either turn on the cloud data in your settings here or turn it off. This is using the cloud data currently. What that means essentially is you're using stored data within the TapClicks data warehouse. With that being said, the data you're looking at is going to be subject to whatever look back window you have built into your system. And if you have an extended look back window you've asked for your customer service team to build into there, that's all going to be accessible to you. However, if you move from a data cloud to a live call widget, which is where you unclick this data cloud, it'll change the widget. Then you have live call widget data. What that does, it gives you current data in your system. It looks back at a 14-month look back window versus a look back window for your store data. And it has different metrics available for you depending on your needs. It's way more robust. And we can show you that here in a little bit as far as how to see those details. But I think we looked on our last session at one of the data views, and there was 10x the metrics available in the live call widget than there were in the stored widget. So it's one of those situations where if you are looking for live call data or just widgets in general and metrics in general, you may realize the stored widget doesn't have what you need, but the live call widget would. So that's something to be mindful of. The other thing I would look at here is, for me, this acquisition details as being the first widget here. I actually found that I needed to remove this widget personally, and I ended up adding a widget that was properties level. That was in Google Analytics. So if we do Analytics, GA4, and then you look at properties, I personally found that my properties level data view had everything I needed to mirror what my clients were seeing inside of their Google Analytics for as far as the sessions, as far as the details. So I actually made a big change in here by introducing the properties. And then rather than using the total users, active users, engagement, I honestly switched all these up to being session-based. And the reason for that is because even though sessions are different in GA4 and GA, sessions provide a let's call it a sense of familiarity for the customer. Because the customer that is mostly being, introduced to this data is not a marketer. They don't necessarily want to understand all the metrics and all the details. So for me, I found that a lot of our customers wanted a sense of familiarity that Google Analytics GA4 had a hard time with providing them for that transition. So we tried to build views that would give them that sense of, okay, yeah, I get what this means. And it may be different. Like sessions is not the same in GA4 as it is GA/UA. And there is a lot of details that you can read up on that show you the exact differences. But it is a close point of reference where people can look at that and go, okay, I know what that means. And if you look at that session line graph on like a blended data chart, you may see that the sessions jump, right, when you get to GA4. And a lot of times it's because those sessions are being counted differently. Sessions in GA4 were typically not being attributed to a user. They were independent. And you did have the ability, if someone's cookie was being tracked, they could come back and see that. But if it was a different device, or if it was a different login, there was ways where it couldn't track that session as accurately. Sessions now are a little different in the way they're tracked. So it is something where I personally found that we use that field a lot more in trying to find that familiarity for clients. We also used different fields in here. Instead of active users, we actually use new users, because new users was what matched into our system here as we were looking at this first column, which I have already moved over somehow. Yeah, I think it's anyway. New users is the first column in here, which is airing out on me. So new users is kind of what I had mentioned. So sessions was in place of total users for us, especially because the numbers seem to be a little bit more accurate with what you would usually see when you were looking in your GA4 as far as your overall users here. The users column, sessions and users were typically going to be more one-to-one than what we found for total users and users. It was a little bit different. We also leveraged engagement rate on here. So instead of active users, we went new users. Instead of total users, we went sessions. So small differences for us. And the point in this is that these templates are not perfect for every occasion, right? And if you think you're going to be able to add a template and that is going to just sit there and you're not going to have to make any changes, one, you're underusing the system, because the system is built for customization. The templates are meant to be a jumping off point, but you should be optimizing these to meet your client needs. And I would say from us, at least, our clients were way more, consistent with their data when they were able to see something that gave them a sense of consistency and continuity. Because we had clients who were literally going to total users here and then going back to GA3 to say, is this data matching? And they try to look at their GA3, GA4, and then the TapClicks instance, and there was not a consistent number with the total users metric across any of them. And they were like, I don't get this. What's happening? So again, it's just customization to your client needs. I'd also optimize. So at least in our instance, we actually removed the engagement field here. We found that a lot of clients that we were working with didn't understand what that was actually telling them. So they were having a hard time with seeing the data and trying to understand it. We could explain it to them, but at the same time, it's really something where we want to build these so the client can log in. It's a 24/7 dashboard, and they have an easy time seeing that data. You can build reports, dashboards in here that are more marketer friendly, that are built for internal teams, and those can have a little bit more in-depth analysis as far as some of those details. But for us, when it was client facing, it just, it made sense to be able to optimize. The other thing I would say is a bit of a challenge when it comes to these reports is making sure that you're recognizing the difference between ad revenue and purchase revenue. A lot of people don't realize, but GA4 actually has AdSense connected, so that if you have AdSense running on your website, that AdSense revenue can actually be added under total ad revenue. This ad revenue is not your Google ads or your Facebook ads. This is actually your AdSense paid system. So money you're making from your AdSense. Purchase revenue is money that you're making from an e-commerce transaction. So just to be very, very clear, this ad revenue for 90% of your clients is not going to be a very, very relevant metric. So you're going to want to change this out, because unless they have AdSense running, it's going to look really confusing, because they're going to see ad revenue. They're going to think it's your ads that you're running, and they're not going to be typically in the know to recognize that this is AdSense, or, you know, the monetization of your own website. So monetization as a naming convention here, it makes sense if you're using this for AdSense, but if you don't have AdSense running, I would call this transactions, e-commerce, you know, one of those kind of situations. I would also point out in your build, as you're optimizing this template, go into your edit function here and then check out the code, because you can actually customize these widgets. So you can add your own layer, linear gradients, so that your color distribution matches your brand better. And this is something that, you know, I've worked in the system for 7 years. I didn't know how to do this. I actually had to go to one of our implementation specialists after I saw her build a report for me. And I was like, how did you do that? That looks so good. And I had to like inquire, but she showed me that it's basically this right here is where you can update that to make it into your brand colors. And then a little tip to the trade is, once you have updated this to make it your brand colors, you can edit this to say, you know, e-commerce, for example. But then once this is done and you get to a point where you like it, you can take this, and everyone should know how to do this, but if you don't, you can publish this to the library and you can save this widget as a reusable template. So I'm going to call this an e-commerce header, right? Don't judge my spelling. I'm just basically typing it quickly here. And then you can name it description e-commerce, and then you can tag it as a header, right? And that'll create a custom header tag. Once you've published this, now you can access this for any of your reports, and you can create these really pretty branded, colored headers that you can add to your sections. I think it just adds a really nice look and feel. The other thing, if you want to look at a design essence, is I really like how when the developers built this template, they had the color scheme that surrounds the view here, that surrounds the widget here as a shadow. I would highly recommend coming in here and checking out the widget settings under styles and just seeing how they did this. What you essentially have here is a background color. You have a background width, corner width, font width, and a size width that matches this background. If you were to change this color to blue, for example, it would change this background. So I'm not going to save this. I want it to be consistent, but you can see that you can customize this look to your current reporting that you do, so that you have continuity between your template, for example, and the ones that you build yourself. I would highly recommend taking a screenshot of these settings, pulling up one of your own reports that you currently built, and just playing with the settings till they match what you have here in these dimensions right here. And you'll see that we have this beautiful border that you add around the drop shadow. You can recreate that within your own reports, and it makes it look a lot more consistent, and it makes it just look a little bit more visually appealing. Also, the drop shadow is one of those things where you can add the widget shadow here. That is also, you can see kind of how that changes it. This guy right here, as you see, this widget has a shadow behind it. It looks like it's kind of lifted, versus on your data reports, it looks like it's more set in. That's a lot of times working with the shadow and working with the designing, because again, you can customize the heck out of this and make it look really fancy.
Brian, I love all of those tips about using a template. As you said, it's a starting point, and
Yep.
when you see something you like, if you use a template, right, you can kind of see how it was built, try and reverse engineer it, customize it to the nth degree. But I think the key takeaway for me is once you build something, right, if you put it in front of your clients, especially with this change to GA4, if it seems confusing to your clients, you might need to modify particularly the data that's there, so your
Oh, yeah.
clients aren't having to also become experts in GA4, right?
Yep.
You mentioned the properties data view. So I hope
Yep.
everyone takes that tip and finds out more about the properties data view so they can use it in their visualizations. But I'm curious how you even came to know about that data view in TapClicks. Do you have any suggestions? Because again, there's so much data and metrics available. How do you work through that in TapClicks?
Great question. Let me preface that question by making two recommendations, and then I'm actually going to show the connectors function that is where we had seen what those user metrics were available for. So the first tip if you haven't looked at it yet. So a lot of clients have said, well, we don't have GA4 for our clients. I have a couple that do, a couple that don't. I don't really want this to be present in every template. So if you don't know already, there is a ability to hard code a widget or a section, pardon me, to a data source. Highly recommend for your GA4 stuff that you come in under manage sections, and then under your section map, assign this to a data source. In this case, it would be a data source, and it would be GA4, Google Analytics. The benefit behind this is that when you have a client who comes in that doesn't have GA4, this section will actually hide so that their view won't be skewed, right? You can also control in your settings, under report settings, if you want to have your widgets be hidden here. So I'd recommend for anybody who wants to use GA4 but is hesitant because their master template is being used across multiple clients, you don't have to be hesitant in that instance, because you can hide that section and make it kind of go away if that's needed. So that's the two things, really, this making sure that's visualized, and then how to make sure that's showing. To answer the question directly, so if nobody has seen the TapClicks connectors site yet, it is a tool that I use in every training, every TapClicks implementation that I do, every new TapClicks license that I sell, I do a full training on these. But it's a big load of data where you can really see everything in all the different data views. And most of you should have been here, should have seen this at one point or another. And if you haven't, it's basically your collection of all your metrics and all your dimensions that are available to you. And these are all done in a way where it's bulked into like a bucket. And the best way I can describe these is that these are all built in a way where it has different data available to you. And if you were to map in every single data view into your instance, it would take 3 hours for your TapClicks instance to load, because it's just so much data, right? As a fun visualization, I was telling someone earlier, if you had a giant toolbox in your garage that you wanted to be mobile, you could move the toolbox around this side of the car, that side of the car. If you load that toolbox with the first 2 drawers having a lot of your basic necessities in it, and the bottom 3 are empty, it's going to be pretty light, and you can move that toolbox around the garage without any issues. But if you just get kind of happy with, loading up your tools into every single drawer, and you just make that toolbox as heavy as possible, it's going to be slow and heavy to move. The system here is the same. If you load up every single metric you can possibly load up into your instance, it is going to drag, and it's going to take a lot of time because you're overwhelming it with data that likely you're not going to use in your reporting. So be mindful as to the tools that you actually put in your toolbox. If you don't work in audience dimensions, don't add the audience details data view. It's going to be a waste of resources. If you don't deal in device segmentation for GA4 reporting, and that's never something you report on, you may not want the device details data view, because it's a bucket of metrics and dimensions that specifically roll into that category. And if that category is not useful to you, it's just going to take up resources. So I recommend being mindful of how many of these you actually add in. I can tell you, I have loaded up, probably as a trainer, almost every single one of these. My TapClicks instance takes about 3 to 5 hours to load in the morning. And it can be a challenge when trying to pull data early in the morning, but it's because of how much data we have. So just be mindful of that. Secondly, you can actually pinpoint and see what metrics you need and maximize that visibility. So to Angela's point from earlier, how we knew we need the properties tab is because we were looking at the users, the new users, as a field that we were trying to visualize. And so as I came in here, you can look at all the metrics available on the stored and live call widget data. So you have stored up here. On demand is the same as a live call widget. So you can see all the data available to you. So if we come down here and we look at some of the metrics available, we have user engagement. New users should be in here somewhere. So if I do a control F, I'm going to do new user. Let's see. So we have new. Let's try users. So we have all the different user metrics. First user medium, first user source. Here we go. So control F you'll find new users. Now, once you have found it in the all dimensions and metrics, if you mouse over it, you'll see all the different data views that this is actually available inside of. And ironically enough, the acquisition details, which is what our initial widget is built on for the GA4 metric, the new users metric has been deprecated. It's been removed. So it may have been available in that data view when this was first built, but it's not currently. So that's where we have to adapt. So what you'll see here is that you can have page, you have page performance, you have properties, stream details. So I chose properties because it seemed to have everything I needed as a metric or as a detailed view. So if I look at properties here, you can specifically see what is available to us and all the different fields that are available. Let's see here. Chat. That was TapClicks entries. Yep. So the other thing to think about is how many points of reference and points of detail is available within the stored widget versus a live call widget. So just for a matter of exercise, you can see how quickly we get to the bottom when scrolling through the properties view here. But if we go into the on-demand and we come down to the properties data view, which all these are broken out into similar data views. Let's see here. So we have region, we have page performance. That's a good example. So not all the data views in the live call are actually available in the stored either. So ironically enough, the properties is one that's available in the stored, but not the on-demand. Anyway, so if we look at our audience, for example, you can see in the live view just how long this list is of metrics that are available to you. Now, when you start building reports using the live widgets, you don't have to go in there and specifically bring them in. These are all available to you. But when you do build that report, it's going to take all that data and it will run a query right there, right then when you build the report. So it does take a little while longer for a live call widget to work. And it's because it's querying all that data right there and then.
And
see your
Brian,
page
I just wanted to
Please.
say that generally TapClicks recommends live calls for sessions data and users data. So just as a general rule of thumb, if you're looking at those metrics, and you'll actually see that if you use that GA4 template, we explain at the top there are some points where live calls are made in those widgets. So just keep that in mind. Sessions and user data, you'll probably want to use a live call for those.
Yep. And there are some situations where there is a lot of consistent development with the GA4 connector. So one of the things you'll notice in here is on the stored data, there's a bit of a lack of information when it comes to product item details. So item ID, item name, all those kind of elements. And it isn't necessarily a limitation from TapClicks side. It's just where they're building and as they're developing it, the on-demand or the live call widgets bring in that available data pretty easily accessible to you. Whereas again, the stored data isn't everything. It's trying to have as much of the data as possible without bogging down the system too bad. So when you're looking at like transaction data, you're going to want to understand that you can look at those detail points at different places within the system. And again, that's where you would come into your all metrics, and you would literally come in here, Control F, find that metric you're looking for, and then see at what data view you need to bring that in or where you need to build that from. I think I mentioned it earlier, about just to clarify, one of the things that I want to make sure is a good tip for everybody is check your check your implementation of your e-commerce tracking, because a lot of times the data layer variables are very different than what was happening in GA4. I had a client that we actually, they implemented GA4. They did not change their data layer variables in the back end. They just used old GA metric implementation recommendations. And it actually ended up tracking half of the GA e-commerce data. Their day-to-day looked at a 50% difference. And what was happening is it was only tracking one item. It wasn't tracking the full transaction. It was only looking at the one single item. And what we found is that the developer took the easy route, and he put in the new data stream number in the GA4 data, but he did not change the data layer variables or any of the e-commerce, developer kind of recommendations. So it was not firing the entire transaction. So being very mindful when you're doing this to ensure that that data, not only the consistency, but that you're actually having your developers install the updates that are needed so that the whole system can be read. I don't know if I covered that earlier. I feel like I covered part of it, but I didn't get into the full specs, which is really making sure that transaction data. Yeah. Making sure that transaction data is fully tracking is super vital. And you will see a 10 to 15% difference when you look at your Shopify versus GA4. Be mindful, it is the case, but it's not necessarily that's broken. It's just there's a discrepancy when it comes to tracked users based on the cookieless environment.
Great. Brian, with our last few minutes, I would like to get to our last topic. So there was a question about blending together data from Universal Analytics and GA4. And I just wanted to say that TapClicks generally doesn't recommend doing that. Neither does Google recommend doing that. And this is really because of the differences. By now, everyone on the call, you've probably seen how different the data is between Universal Analytics and GA4. However, Brian, I know you have some tips for how you handle that because we all need to still report on this, right? We have clients that have used Google Analytics for many years. So
Yep.
what would you recommend doing in TapClicks to kind of show that continuity, even though we've changed tools to GA4?
Yeah. So one thing that I would say is that first off, if you are dealing with migrating the data from GA3 and you want to make sure that your client, for example, is asking for a lot of year-over-year data, I would take advantage of the current situation, which is where TapClicks has the ability to ingest, I think it's the 5 to 8 years worth of data from GA3, ingest that data into their warehouse, and then act upon it as needed. So instead of having to do a BigQuery import and then export that into TapClicks can just pull that data from Google Analytics for a long window of time and then store that data for you so you can then visualize off of it. Once that's done, however, now you have to figure out how to visualize that data. So the blended data quandary, the complexity is built around the fact that a lot of people started using GA4 at the same time GA3 was running. And you have a lot of sessions and data points that are doubled up. So if you were to run a long trend line of GA3 and then GA4, there's a period of time for a good year or two where a lot of clients had both running. So sessions, if you try to blend that data, will start to basically double up during that time where both were running at the same time. So you kind of have to figure out a source of truth and a date range for when that source of truth kind of hits. So the first preface on this is I would be very mindful of the fact that, as we talked about earlier, sessions isn't sessions in the same instance as it was before. Sessions, as for what it tracks, have changed. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it is 100% different, right? The example I've used before is it's kind of like an apple, right? This isn't an apple versus an orange. It's an apple that's a Gala apple versus a Honeycrisp, right? It's still an apple by nature, but it isn't the same genes. It isn't the same genealogy, right? But if you were to do a report of how many apples you sold versus how many oranges you sold, Honeycrisp and Gala apples would still roll up into the same report, right? You as the marketer still have to recognize that those are two different apple breeds. But when you look at it as a macro, it's still a fruit, right? If you're looking at fruit, you have to look at the overall summaries. So that being said, if you're trying to understand your sessions over time and you're looking at year-over-year numbers, right? First off, educate your client that the numbers will vary when it comes to GA4 versus GA3. But then secondly, there is some reporting that now has been built in to allow and accommodate for this. So I'll show that on my screen real quick to show you kind of what one of the solutions that the TapClicks team has implemented to help you with this. So first off, you can create a channel inside of TapClicks that uses GA and GA4 and GA3 as the data sources. And then what you can be done in here is you can create a visualization that looks at certain data metrics and brings that data in as a unified channel. Now,
Brian, I think we're not hearing you any longer.
oh,
There we go.
That's weird. Okay. Okay, let me back up then. So with your channel settings, you have the ability to have your GA and GA4 aggregated into a channel data level. So with that, it will roll that data up into one metric, one report. So what you can do is bring in, like, for example, your sessions, which is a great kind of medium, right? It's something that everyone is going to recognize. And then you can map this in. However, as we talked about, it will double up where you have that data for a period of time. So what the TapClicks team did in order to help this out is they added boundaries. And the boundaries are essentially ways for you, the consumer, to set up a date that is essentially the starting point for your new point of truth, right? Your new starting point of truth. So you can set your date range for Google Analytics to go back to 2012, 15, or whatever it might be. But end that information, let's call it on June 1st of 2023. And then for GA4, the new source of truth is going to be the day after you ended the GA numbers. And that would go until perpetuity, essentially. So you can say GA, let's put this 2033. We have it for the next 10 years. It'll be looking at that data. So essentially what you're doing is you're saying GA data runs to here, and then it stops. And then the day after, GA4 data starts. So when you look at this data in perpetuity in a line, a trend line, you're going to see the day-to-day consistently show what that numbers look like. Now, again, educate your client, make sure you're not false representing what this data is. If you don't know the difference between session to GA4, session to GA3, do some Googling. You can find the information fairly easily, but make sure your clients understand the difference, because if you're going to blend this data, it's your responsibility to make sure they understand what it is you're blending and what the discrepancies might be, because they may see a year over year, session increase of 30%. And they're like, oh my God, we did amazing. We got 30% increase in sessions. Well, what percentage of that 30% was already kind of accounted for in the GA to GA4 transition? And how much of that was you actually doing a good work and providing a lift? It is important that you're not taking that lift from GA to GA4 and accounting for that in your own, your own successes. It is just a metric that you're looking at that changed the definition of it. So I think there's a responsibility in the marketer to recognize where that discrepancy is, and even look at the numbers between GA and GA4 for a certain time frame, and make your own assessment. If I'm looking at April of 2022 and I have both GA and GA4 running, how many sessions did I have? And the nice thing about TapClicks is you can actually check yourself by creating a widget that's a GA4 widget and a GA3 widget right next to each other in one of your reports, and show sessions for both. And you can see that there's a 10% general discrepancy, and then account for that in your reporting so that you're not over reporting and you're not taking credit for something that really isn't real. That's the ethical decision that I would recommend people take. Check yourself, make sure the numbers are appropriate, check out what your standard deviation is, and then account for that.
Brian, thank you so much for walking us through that. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I want to just in the chat, I'm going to give you one more resource. If you're curious about how to learn more about TapClicks and GA4, we have a wealth of information on this page. There's lots of content to look at there. But Brian, thank you again. You are such an expert with TapClicks and GA4. Really appreciate all of the participation today. And once again, we have a couple more sessions coming up, so you're welcome to sign up for those if it works for your schedule.
Yep. And then one quick point,
Yeah.
if you guys have any questions or want any kind of feedback on what's happening in your own instance, our team is available to help. We do offer a GA4 audit, which for participants of our webinars or our sessions has a discount. It's usually $500. We're doing it for $450. And then if you have any questions as far as implementation, let me know. Our team's here to help.
Awesome. Brian, thank you so much. And everyone, with that link earlier, you can go find SmartTech and figure out how to get in touch with Brian should you want to take advantage of more help. Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, afternoon, evening.
Thank you, everyone.